Hey everybody, it's Justin, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a simple Salesforce to QuickBooks integration. This is going to include a sync, so we can sync the account as a customer inside of QuickBooks, as well as we're going to create a custom object invoice that will store the data to create an invoice within QuickBooks. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new account called G2 Technologies. Nothing fancy needs to be made here. I'm going to go ahead and sync this so that then we can go and look inside of QuickBooks. If I go ahead and refresh and scroll down, then what you'll see is we have the company G2 Technologies, which was just created. And then from the account page, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a contact, and we're going to use this as a primary, kind of like a primary billing, so then we can email the invoice out. So I'll just do that, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an opportunity. We're just going to have this as a closed won opportunity. So I'm going to create a test op. I'm just going to make the amount as $1,000, and we'll have the close date as today, and we'll make it closed won. So save. On the opportunity, I have let's see, the invoice related object here. So we're just going to go ahead and press new. I'm just going to give it a subtotal as $1,000, and I'm going to make the terms net 60 and save this, and we'll go ahead and go to the invoice and then sync with QuickBooks. And you'll see some information gets filled out. If we go to the customer, here, when QuickBooks decides to load, then you can see the invoice here inside of QuickBooks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up. Postman, and we're going to run through some of the authentication and setup you need to do within QuickBooks to get the QuickBooks API running, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we're inside the QuickBooks API documentation, and this is probably the first page you're going to be greeted with if you search for, QBO API. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to go to the dashboard, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new app. So I'm just going to call it test 2 since I already have test 1. All we need for a scope is accounting, and we're going to create the app. We're just going to be setting this up in a development org. If you go to keys and OAuth in production, you'll see you have to do a few more things for your account, which shouldn't be an issue if you're releasing this for a client. But for the sake of this demo here, we're just going to be doing it in development. And we have a client ID and client secret. Not much to say here. But what I want to do is I want to go to this API Docs and Tools and Postman. I'm just going to open this in a new tab so that then we can navigate quickly. And these are the instructions to actually make this work inside of Postman. And the biggest thing here is in step 5, we actually want to add a redirect URI. So we're going to do that now. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to add the URI here, and then I'm going to save. Brilliant. And from there, we're ready to go and add this into Postman. So what I'm going to do is just go through all of the things you need to actually get the API working. We're going to configure a new token. Token name doesn't matter. Callback URI, the get Postman OAuth 2 callback. this should be standard. The auth URL. So if we go back to here, we have, and we can see what to enter here. Auth URL, the App Center Intuit, access token URL, same thing. Client ID and client secret. So we're going to copy the client ID and we're going to copy paste that in there. We're going to add the client secret. We're going to paste that into there. Scope, we want to use the Java syntax of the accounting scope. So it's com.intuit.quickbooks.accounting. Not much to say there. And state, this could be anything. I'm just going to call it Salesforce. And then client authentication, we want to send client credentials in body. We're going to generate a new access token and a window is going to pop up. If you haven't signed in before, then you'll need to sign in. So let me just take care of that really fast. And let's see, so I'm going to sign in. And then we'll say connecting test2, which is the app name, to test account, which is the QuickBooks instance. I'm just going to say connect. And it's complete and we can proceed. And so we have an access token and we also have a refresh token. And so what we'll be doing in the integration is we'll actually be using this refresh token that we get from Salesforce or from Postman and using that to authenticate within Salesforce. But for now, I'm just going to go use token. The next thing I'm going to do is do a sample call. So just going to go back to the account object. A couple things to note about the QuickBooks API. The first is that if I scroll down a little bit more so you can see this, there's different URLs for production and sandbox, and this is the QuickBooks sandbox in production. So for today, we're going to be using the sandbox QuickBooks URL. And then the other thing you'll notice is that there's a v3, which is the API version, company / and then this number. So that's actually the ID of the company. You can find it here. Would probably be the easiest way. And you can actually switch these if you are using like sandboxes or production. But since I'm just using sandbox here, it is not a big deal. And then the account is just the URL for this to create. And then a minor version is just some sort of subversion that comes out every couple of months. I'm not sure what the release schedule is. Past that, that's pretty much everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sample call where we're just going to get all the accounts through a query. So we have this sandbox QuickBooks API intuit.com, and then we want to do the v3 / company, and you can actually just copy all of this. Make sure there's no space. And the query, I'm just going to say select all from, let me just do this, from, is it account or customer? Yeah, account. And then I'm going to go ahead and send. And what we can see if I bring up the body is we have a JSON. A few other things to note is in headers, you want to make sure you have the content type as application JSON and the accept as application JSON. Otherwise, you will get XML by default. And we have various accounts. Not much to say here. All of these are just the standard test accounts from QuickBooks. With that knowledge ahead, we're going to go ahead and set up Salesforce to mirror this setup and hold all the information we need, be it the company ID, the URL, the refresh token, etc. So I'm going to jump into a new Salesforce instance, and we'll get going from there. Okay, so we are back in Salesforce, and we're going to be doing a lot of configuration here to make sure that we can accommodate for all the model. It's not, I would say it's not too complex, and if you're setting this up for a client, then you might have to make quite a few adjustments here to fit within their model, but we do need to do a little bit of customization here and initial configuration to get this working. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a custom setting and a custom metadata. Now, because we need to use Apex to update the custom setting will be required. Now, what you could do is you could have everything in the custom setting, but my preference is that we have anything that stays static within a metadata. And the reason why is just because of the simple fact that when you're pushing between sandboxes, you get to keep the metadata and don't have to re-enter information, which is nice. So what I've done is created a metadata. I've called it QB metadata. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple custom fields. So the first one is going to be a URL, and we're going to call this field base URL. Not much here. And then we're going to have the company ID, which is going to be called company ID, and we're going to have minor version. And the minor version and company ID can actually be numbers, as QuickBooks uses numbers for both, but just for the typing inside of the code, I just prefer to do text, but you could do them either way. Next thing we're going to be doing is we are going to be creating a custom setting, and I'm going to call this QuickBooks Data, and it's going to be public hierarchy, and we're going to need quite a few fields here. So I'm going to make a text field that's called client secrets. And I'm going to make a text field called client ID. I'm going to make another text field called refresh token. Going to make a date time called last updated. And I'm going to make a URL field called auth URL. And this is all the data that we need to store to basically run the integration, and it's considered best practice to have these inside of custom settings or custom metadata as opposed to in the code. And for the instance of the refresh token, it's actually required that we have this inside a custom setting or custom object. The next thing, and so all of those fields that we just made are what we're going to be using to store this information that we just put in, or well, most of it. Or for instance, this company ID. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to remote site settings. And this is for integrations required because Salesforce requires permission to send information out. So we're going to do 2. I'm going to call this QuickBooks _ sandbox, and we're going to take that sandbox QuickBooks URL. We'll keep it active, and we're going to do QuickBooks Auth as well, which is going to be the oauth.platform URL right here. The next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating the sync token and ID, the QuickBook ID and QuickBook sync token fields on the account. And what this does is you can see here, not here. You can see it in the body of the response for a given QuickBooks account, and for that matter, any object within QuickBooks. We have an ID and we have a sync token. And so the ID is simply the reference to the object within the database, similar to Salesforce ID, similar to an ID in any other system. Not much to say there, although when you're creating accounts, then this makes it easy so you can reference the ID as opposed to the name. The next thing is the sync token, and this is QuickBooks' way of basically versions or version controls. Not necessarily version control, but versions. And it's the version of the data. And so if you attach a version, or you try to push a version of the data with a sync token that is prior to whatever's in the QuickBooks database, you'll actually get an error. So it's important that we store this. And additionally, it's important that we check every time we try to update this data that we have the most recent sync token. I'm going to go ahead and create it actually just on the account. We're not going to be including contact sync in this integration, but I'm going to call this, let me see what I called it in the org. So we're going to give this a text field, which is going to be called QuickBooks ID. And it's not going to be required, but we want it to be unique, case insensitive, although it doesn't matter, as again, the ID is the number, and we want this to be an external ID. We will also want to do a text field that is the sync token. So I'm going to call this, I'm actually going to call it QuickBooks Online sync token, like so. And wouldn't recommend having it required. It certainly should not be unique, and it also certainly shouldn't be an external ID. So we'll save that. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to create the invoice object. So I don't have anything in here, or I do because I guess this is a standard object now. Oh, this might be for something. Well, I'm going to go ahead and create a custom invoice object here. To just use my own information. This is, most Salesforce orders don't have an invoice object. Or maybe they do now. The other thing from here is we want to change this to an auto number. So I'm just going to use a 5-digit code here, and we actually want the starting number to be like 10,000. The auto number for QuickBooks starts at 1,000, and there's test data, and so it would actually just be best to not deal with the collision of the numbers, because that runs into its own set of challenges. With that, we're going to create quite a few fields here. So We'll create a description. We'll create a due date. Going to create a master detail lookup to the opportunity. I think it's best practice to do master detail lookup here, and we'll just call it opportunity. We will create a text field that's going to be called QuickBooks ID. We will also make this 255, and we won't make it required, but we want this to be unique and an external ID. We'll have a sync token. We'll have a subtotal, which is going to be a currency. We'll have tax, which will be a currency. We'll have terms, which will be a pick list, and this is the due on receipt. Net 10, net 15, etc. I'm just gonna go and I am going to go and just copy whatever the standard terms are. But if you are using this for, again, a client, then they might have different terms, and I'll show you how to actually map the terms based on the ID inside of QuickBooks. And the last field we want to make is the total. So with that, we have all the setup needed inside of the Salesforce database, and I'm going to go ahead and open VS Code, and we'll go and authenticate and create a new instance so we can go from there. Okay, so we are in VS Code, and I'm going to go ahead and create a project. I'm going to use the empty template and call it QuickBook Sync. This is a great place. Just doing the usual, setup here. Nothing out of the ordinary, and this is actually in my other browser for the sync, but nevertheless. Okay, so what are we going to get done first? I think that we should go and get the authentication working within Salesforce, because that is probably one of the most painful things to do. So I'm going to go ahead and create an Apex class, and I'm just going to call it QB callout. The way that I had this architected is instead of using static methods, I actually have this as a class that you must use a constructor method for, and I think that that works the best for what we're doing here and enforcing the refresh to happen on instantiation. So I'm going to copy the constructor method over, which is pretty much the same. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling a refresh method, which is going to be giving us a list of strings called the tokens. And the way that I have that done is as follows. So I'm just going to run through the code as opposed to typing everything out. So we're getting the custom setting data here. You could also use the custom setting method as well as its hierarchy. We are just setting all the various things we need. So we have the auth URL, we have the client ID, we have the client secrets, and then we're going to create the header. This is the auth header. So it's going to be basic and then a space, and then we're going to base64 encode the blob of the client ID : client secret. So this is one string. The refresh token is going to be this refresh token. And we have the body as grant type equals refresh token, and refresh token equals, well, the refresh token. So we're going to create a request, pretty standard Salesforce API call, method as post. The body is again this grant type. Authorization is this auth header here. We do want this content type to be the application URL or form URL encoded. We're going to send this. We're going to debug this as well. And we're going to use this QB refresh JSON, which is just a way of parsing that. And I'll go ahead and create that in a second. Additionally, if the access token is null, that means the refresh token is expired. So we're going to throw a custom exception. And then what I've done here is just the return. We are creating as a list of string, which is the access token and then the refresh token. I think this is the best way of dealing with this. So then you can have two return values and not need a custom data type for this. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to create the QuickBooks exception. So this is pretty standard custom exception. So we'll just even delete this, and this is going to extend exception. That's extends and deploy. Great. The next thing we're going to do is this QuickBooks refresh JSON. So let's go ahead and create this. And I will go ahead and just copy this from the JSON to Apex method for the customer. I'll show you how to get this data in as well as update things, but I don't believe it's necessary to show every single one. So with that, if I deploy this, then this will be good to go. So great. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fill out the data inside of Salesforce. So let's get that going. So let's see. Let's do the metadata first. So I'm just going to make a new record called default. And The base URL is going to be that sandbox QuickBooks API Intuit.com. The minor version right here, right now it happens to be 59. Again, you can see that just in a sample call. And it looks like I'm not signed in, so let me just sign in again. Great, so we're signed in, and so the minor version, the most recent minor version has to be 59, or it happens to be 59, and then the ID happens to be this ends in 690. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste that, and we have the minor version as well. So the metadata setup, let's just go ahead and make sure the settings is set up as well. So I'm going to create a new for the default organization, and to get the client ID, we're just going to copy that. Client secret, we're going to copy that. We don't have a refresh token. We'll be getting that. Later on. We also don't have the last updated date, as we'll be updating that when we update. And the auth URL, let's see, is going to be, the best way to get that is to go to Postman and get this auth URL. And actually, this is actually outdated. So I believe it's not actually this, it's the access token URL that you need. So, great. And with that, I'm going to add one final method in the callout here before we get started, and that's going to be this method called update refresh token. And what this does is basically just all the it's just adding the refresh token from the QuickBooks data, or sorry, from the instantiated object. It's adding that to the custom setting. It's saying the last updated is datetime.now, and we're updating the QuickBooks data. So with that, if I go and open, well, first of all, if I push this, that did push, great. So if I push that and open developer console, then what we can do is we can just update the refresh token. So we're going to create a new QuickBook callout, like so, and we're just going to say that callout dot update refresh token, and this way we can update the refresh token, and it's going to say the refresh token is expired because there's some sort of error. So let's see what the error is. Get an invalid grant. Oh, yes, because we need to actually copy the refresh token. Sorry. We need to grab the refresh token that we were using from QuickBooks to get a client ID. I'm in Postman right now. So what we need to do is we need to actually grab this refresh token and put it inside the custom setting here. And then now when we go to the developer console and execute, then of course the refresh token has expired. So perfect. And now when we refresh, then we have the last updated date. Brilliant. So we'll be using that to go and create the customer invoice callouts. So with that, let's go ahead and get to creating the customer callouts. Another lesson in the QuickBooks API is that what we'll want to do is inside of Postman, we'll actually want to query for where the display name equals the account name in case that doesn't exist. Otherwise, we will just be creating the customer. So let's go ahead and write a few more calls here, or write a few more methods. So the next method we're going to do is this get customer method. So what we have here is we have a QuickBooks customer JSON, and I'll be showing that, but we're going to have a method get customer, which is going to take an account as parameter. We're going to say if account's null, null reporting exception, just a nice little rainy day check. We're going to make the query ourselves. So I have string query, so select all from customer. This can also be account, where job equals false. So that just means it's a sub customer. This is kind of a check in some sort of production org where people are using sub customers. And display name equals account name, and then we're going to replace basically a quote. So like McDonald's would actually fail. So we need to escape that with a backslash quote, which looks, I guess, a little funny in Apex, but nevertheless. That being said, if the ID is not null, which means there's an ID, then instead of looking by the display name, well, why not just look by the ID? And we'll debug the query. We're going to initialize the URL. So we have metadata, which we're just grabbing, and we're just going to say the base URL plus v3/company plus the company ID plus query question mark minor version, and then the query we're actually just going to set as the body. So again, create HTTP request, request response, the access token. We probably don't need to debug that, but the URL is the endpoint. Method's going to be post. Set the query as the body. Here is the authorization header as the access token. Again, these two lines are pretty critical here. The accept application JSON content type application text. You could also have this as application JSON, but make sure the accept is application JSON. We'll send that. We'll debug it as well, just so we can look at it in the debug console. we have this handle error response error, which I'll show the method there in a second. And that just shows if there's some sort of error within the API call that's unforeseen, like a invoice number collision, etc. And then we're going to create the customer JSON by parsing the body and returning the JSON. So we have this handle error response. So I have this as a private method. I'll just slap this up here. So we take in a string body and we have this QuickBooks error JSON, and we're going to say if error does not equal null, then error.fault does not equal null. A couple other things, couple just kind of null checks. We're going to throw a QuickBooks exception of the first error. And so let me show you what an error looks like inside of QuickBooks. So I'm just going to add a count to AAAA because that's not a real object. So you'll see here this fault with an error, and it says invalid query. So we can actually use that information to debug. But if it doesn't parse, then we're not going to throw any exceptions. So let's go ahead and we'll actually just show this right here, how to take this into JSON to Apex. What was the class name? QuickBooks error JSON is what I'm going to call this. We actually don't need to create explicit parse code for this, and we'll just copy paste it, and we get the error JSON, and we'll just go ahead and copy this into here. So we'll create an Apex class called QuickBooks error JSON, and deploy that, and we will do the test class as well. Just note that all the source code here is in the description, so please feel free to use and reference that when you are building this out yourself. The last thing is the test code, and I will just copy that from here. And we'll deploy this, of course. That does not like that because I have some sort of, oh, I have explicit parsing here. So I suppose in this case, we do need explicit parsing. Or how did I do this? Oh, it's just time Z instead of time X. Yes. This is why you don't mix and match code bases. So we'll just use the old one, just the same. So now that we have the error JSON, we have the ability to select customer based on the we have the ability to select the customer based on the query. So for instance, if I did, we'll just do from customer where display name equals G2 technologies. So you can see this display name here. And so this is the query response, which is what this will respond with here. So I'm going to go ahead and create that now, so we can parse that information. And I am just going to copy and paste from the old code base. And I don't actually have a test class for this, which is not the end of the world. So with that, we can get a customer. Now the thing is we'll also want to create a customer. So let's go ahead and get that method created as well. So I have this create customer call. So again, we're going to take the customer data, or we're going to create the account data. We're going to map the data to basically a JSON in the required format. We're going to initialize the URL, go through all the HTTP methods, and then we will, the only difference is we'll get the customer response JSON. So I'll go ahead and create the Apex class for that. Again, please see the code down in the description below. And we have a test class as well. So we'll go and deploy that. But circling back here to the top, we have this QuickBooks map or QB map class that we're going to use to actually hold all the methods to map from the account to the necessary JSON. So I'm going to go ahead and create the Apex class called QB map. And this is pretty standard within integrations, needing to map data between various systems. So I'm going to call this QB map, and we are actually just going to use static mapping here. And going to go ahead and copy paste this in, and I'm actually going to copy the whole method, not just part of it. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a method map account data that takes in an account, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to use the QB customer JSON, this class here, and this has a subclass called customer, which is this here, and we can just populate the various fields within this and just use the JSON method, JSON.serialize, to go and use that data. So we'll create a customer. The way that I have this is the company name is account.name. The taxable status is true. The sync token is going to be the account.sync token. And customer sparse equals true. That's a flag to only explicitly update what's been given. So if there's something that hasn't been given, then don't go and use that information. We want to do a billing address. So we have nothing here, but in Postman, but on the customer JSON, we have a billing address class, which is just a line 1 city, etc. So we want to map that accordingly. So we have ship address is going to be, it's the same class and it's called bill address, but it's fine. But so we have the city, street, state, postal code, country, map, and then we want to assign the ship address to this. We want the print on check name to be account.name. We want the primary phone, and this happens to be a class, but the phone.freeform number is going to be account.phone, and then we're going to assign the primary phone to phone. Customer job, again, this is like a sub customer kind of way to look at things. We just want to use this as not a job. So false is project false. The ID is going to be the account.QuickBooks Online ID, and the display name is going to be account.name. Similar to the shipping address, we're going to be mapping the billing address fields. Not going to go into that. We have the active flag set to true, which just means that the actively doing business with this client. And then we want to serialize the customer object. The one thing to note here is that you do want to replace the long X with long inside the QuickBooks customer JSON. You have the longitude as long underscore X, and this is a collision with the standard Salesforce nomenclature, and so JSON to Apex gets around this. However, what you need to do is replace it on the JSON string, and so this is how we do that, by replacing long X like so. And this is kind of just also a safeguard, so it's only replacing this where it's the key, whereas maybe you had someone long underscore Xavier, not sure, but you'd have a hard time syncing there. So with that, we have all of the callouts and mapping required. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy this code to Salesforce, and I'm also going to deploy the callout to Salesforce. So with that, we could create a new account and sync it to, we could create a new account and sync it to Salesforce or to QuickBooks, but this is very convoluted and not a good user-friendly way. So the way that I have it as buttons in the demo is what we'll be doing, and they're actually not buttons, they are actions, and specifically object actions as opposed to global actions. And so the way I have this set up is I have a page, and we're going to not make it as a class, but as a Visualforce page, and I'm going to use the standard account controller and use a a controller extension. And this way you can have it as an action instead of a global action. I think this is probably a best practice here. Additionally, you want to have the controller. So I have this QuickBooks Customer Sync controller, which I'm going to create now. And we will copy paste this in and deploy that, as well as deploy this. Okay, so this is going to be a standard Visualforce controller, and this is probably the best way to do it because Lightning components, as of the time of recording, do not support actions and Aura components. It would just be kind of a convoluted way of getting to this. So I believe that when you're syncing with the button like this, this is the best way to do so. So What are we going to do? We have an ID as the account ID. We have the account as the account. We're going to instantiate the class, passing in a standard controller. The account ID is the current page.getParameters.getID. And then we're going to get a lot of fields. I'm not going to read over all of these fields, but it's basically the ID name, QuickBooks tokens, the shipping fields, the billing fields, and the phones. And we have a page reference sync QuickBooks, which is the action here on the Visualforce page when you load. And so we want to create a new callout similar to how we did in the developer console, and then we want the account data to be the callout.getCustomerData. And this is the query data. So if we find a customer like here, then what we're going to do is we're going to check the size. So first of all, we're going to say we only want to sync this if there's one data. This is kind of a data control. So then best practice within data, not creating duplicate data. But if the size is only one, then we are going to we're going to iterate through the list, and we're going to say the ID is the customer ID and the sync token is the sync token. That being said, this is just to get the ID and the sync token. So if there's no response, that's okay. So we'll create the customer callout. We'll debug the push data, and we will look at the ID and update accordingly, assuming it's not null, and the sync token, again, assuming it's not null. We will update the refresh token, and now that we're done with callouts, update the account. Finally, return the page reference, which is just the account you started with. And again, this customer call is what we're using to push the data to QuickBooks. So with that, we have the ability to create a customer. So I'm going to go ahead and create the action now. And we're going to not create a custom object, but we're going to go to the account, and we need to go to button, links, and actions. We're going to do a new action, which is going to be a Visualforce page, and it's because I only have the one page, it's going to select the right one, and we're just going to call this sync with QuickBooks. And we need to add this to the page layout, so we have this account layout, which I'm going to add this to, which happens to be a mobile or a lightning action, and you want to override this, and I know this is messy here, but we'll add this at the very top. Save this. Now, if I go to the Sales app and go to Accounts and create a new company, and we'll go ahead and add some of the billing and shipping address as well. So I don't know, 123 Main Street, San Diego. We'll add that as well. And if we go and sync this, take some time to load, but with that, we'll be redirected here. Again, you'll see this QuickBooks ID and the QuickBooks sync token. We'll see, and I'll just make sure this is signed in. we will see not the invoice, but if we go to the customers and scroll down to T, we see Taggart Transcontinental. If we go to customer details, we can see the billing and shipping address here. And additionally, now that this is synced, what's great is if I want to update this, let's say I want to update this to incorporated, I go to Inc. and save it, sync this. You'll notice once we get redirected that we have the sync token at 1 because it's the different version ID. And if I refresh this, then we have the incorporated added as well. Great. So with that, we have concluded the account sync. So I'm going to go and dive into the invoicing. Okay, so the final piece of the puzzle here is to sync an invoice. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go over the API documentation a little bit. So I'm just going to open this in a Vim buffer and so what we have here is an invoice JSON, and we're going to send over an object, and it has a couple different fields. I think the biggest thing that needs to be said is that the we send information over in lines. So it's an array of lines, and each line has a quantity, unit price, etc. So we'll be mapping that to a given product. I've selected the, I believe it's the services product. You can create your own product inside the QuickBooks menu here, or you can use an existing one. The other important thing is that we have taxes as lines, and we have, let's see, the terms. So if we go to the API documentation, we actually can see the sales term reference, and we'll need the value there. So to get, let's see if it's even in here. Yeah, so we'll need a value, and this ID is what correlates to that, like net 15, net 30, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into VS Code, and like the customer, we'll need to have a call out for getting the invoice solely to get the sync token, and we'll need a call out to create the invoice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy over the get call first. And I'm just going to put this at the bottom. So we have a method get invoice, which returns an invoice query JSON, and we have a rainy day check here. And what we do is we say select ID from invoice, where ID equals the invoice ID. Sure, makes sense. We build the URL as we've done for the previous examples, and we parse this into an invoice query JSON. And the structure of this is, if I go into Postman, and instead of term, do invoice. So this is that structure. We have a query response object, and then an array of invoices, which have various fields. Again, the only thing we need from this is actually the ID, but the ID will be null, and we'll be actually writing that on the create call. and then the sync token, because you need the latest sync token for callouts. And then the next thing is we need to create an invoice. So let's go ahead and paste this in as well. So I'm going to make the body, the JSON body that's required. I'm just going to call a function map invoice, and very straightforward HTTP call, and we're going to return the QuickBooks invoice response JSON, which is how we write the invoice ID. So let's go ahead and create a couple classes. First of all, let's create this invoice query JSON. And I could use this response in the JSON to Apex, but I already have the code, so we'll just go ahead and copy paste this. And we'll also, it looks like I don't have the test class in here, but I'll go ahead and deploy this. We also have the QuickBooks invoice response. So let's go ahead and create that as well. And copy paste. The next thing we'll need to do is we'll actually need to create the map function. So this get call will work just fine, but I want to map to create the invoice. So this function right here. So let's go ahead and copy this over. Which is a pretty hefty method here. So let's talk about this. So take a parameter of invoice custom object, and we're going to return the JSON string. The invoice JSON is what I'm going to be using. So this is basically a serialization of this object. So we're just going to be populating everything to the object and then using the JSON.serialize to return string. We need to create a line class, and we need to, we need to instantiate the line class, and then we need to instantiate the sales item detail. And we have basically the invoice object.line, which is the lines array needs to be instantiated, as this is how you work with typed objects. And so we have the amount mapped to the subtotal, which is just going to be the line item amount. We have the detail type being the sales item line detail, which is just the type. We have the ID and sync token as fields. Now keep in mind that if there's no ID, then it's a create call, and if there is an ID, then it would be an update call. We have the due date mapped here. For this example, we have allow online ACH payment equals true, credit card payment equals true. I want the invoice number, so how I have the auto number, INV dash, and then the 5-digit number. I'm just going to go ahead and replace that to make the number, and then the doc number is going to be just the auto number itself. Email status is not set. The email is going to be contact, on the account we have a contact, which I can go ahead and create, but we want some way to assign this. So for this example, what I'm going to do is just create on the account a contact lookup, and we will use this as a primary, like a primary contact. And sometimes people have it on the quote, or not on the quote, on the opportunity. Sometimes they have it on the account. It just depends on the org's setup and customer needs. So and then we're going to use that email as the bill to email. The customer reference is required. This is the ID of the customer. So let's see if I can find it. Yeah, so an invoice must have customer ref populated. So we're going to do so by getting the account's QuickBooks ID. That means that it's required to have the account synced before you can create an invoice. I have a memo reference here is just the invoice description. And I have the sales terms. So these sales terms aren't actually what's in the sandbox. So let's go ahead and cover the sales terms mapping. Like I said, this is how you get the net 10, net 15, due on receipt, whatever is in the whatever is in QuickBooks. Now the thing is that what QuickBooks has may not be as IDs. So what I'm using as IDs here may not be what is the ID for the various terms in your QuickBooks org. And this can change between sandbox and production as well inside of QuickBooks. So if we go to sales rep terms, let's see, just scroll down. I think it's in line. Yeah, sales term ref right here. So it says it's optional, and the reference to the sales term associated with the transaction. And the way they recommend this is query the term name list resource to determine the appropriate term object for this reference. And then we can use the term.id and term.name. Now I don't recommend doing the name, as this is basically just extra work, but you need the value. And so because of that, what we'll do is we'll head over to Postman and we'll say, instead of select all from invoice, we'll select all from term. And we can see here, so we have the name, which is due on receipt, which is what we have mapped to the term pick list in Salesforce. And we have an ID is here as well. And the sync token doesn't matter for terms. But so what we'll do to map this appropriately is we'll say due on receipt is the invoice.terms, and we said that the ID is 1. And I'm assuming that we'll have to change these around a little bit. Net 10 is going to be sales ref 5, so let's, our ID of 5, so let's go ahead and map that. No, I can make this bigger as well. Net 15 is 2, net 30 is 3. We don't have a partial payment, but net 60 is going to be 4. So I'll just say if there's some other term, then it'll just automatically map to net 60. And we'll of course assign that here. We want to create the billing address. So we're just going to use the opportunities account for the billing information. Same with the shipping address. have a little bit of fancy postal stuff here, but nothing crazy. The item ref, so this is the sales. So I wanted this to be sales. I think in this service, it's services in the sandbox. So item ref here, and we'll assign that. The tax code reference, I just have this as tax. And we want to add the line to the invoice object, and then we serialize the invoice object. And again, replacing long X with long. So if I go ahead and deploy this, and I believe I still need to make this QuickBooks invoice. Yeah. So let's go ahead and make the QuickBooks invoice class really fast. And that's going to store all the data. And let's see what I put in for the subtotal. Oh, I just forgot to create the subtotal field. So go ahead and create this as well. So with that, we have the map class in, and then we will sync the QuickBook callout now that all the classes have been and methods have been created. So with that, we can now create an invoice within Salesforce. Again, the only issue is that you would need to create, you would need to basically you could only use this in the developer console, which is not very useful. So what we're going to be doing is, like the customer button, we're going to make a button for the invoice. So I'm going to make an Apex class called QuickBooks Invoice Controller. I am also going to create a page called QuickBooks Invoice _visual. And this is the Visualforce page. We'll go ahead and deploy that. We'll just go ahead and copy paste the controller code, and then we'll sync them at the same time. Let's see what this says. Balance due. We won't sync the balance due. So, okay. Okay, so we have a QuickBooks Invoice Controller, and we have the ID, which is going to be controller.record.getRecord.id. This is another way to get the ID for the page. We're going to query the related fields for the invoice, which are quite a lot. And the reason why we need to do this is because we need to get related fields, which is not available on just the controller.getRecord. And then we're going to sync with QuickBooks. So we're going to create a new callout. We're going to have the query JSON, which is just the response from get invoice. So if there is an invoice, then we want to make sure that there's only one invoice, which is somewhat redundant with the ID. But nevertheless, we're just going to assign the QuickBooks ID and sync token to the related fields in Salesforce. And the next thing we'll do is we'll get the QuickBooks invoice response. which will call out that will be the response from our create invoice call. And after that, we want to start our DMLs. So we're going to update the refresh token, and then we're going to update the ID, sync token, tax, and total. And update the invoice and redirect to the same ID. So let's go ahead and deploy this. Let's go ahead and deploy the Visualforce page as well. And back in Salesforce, we're going to create a action, which is going to be a Visualforce page called Sync with QuickBooks, and add this to the page layout. And for one final time, we will go through the Sync with QuickBooks for the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and if I go back to sales, so we have our account, and because we already have this synced with QuickBooks, we're able to use this account. If we didn't have this synced, we would actually get an error. But I'm going to go and create an opportunity. Again, just, I don't know, test op. We'll have the close date as today, and closed one. And we'll have the amount as 1,000. And we'll create a related invoice. And if you're at a client org, maybe you have some sort of automation for this, but we'll just have the due date here, and we'll have the terms be due on receipt, I suppose. So we have invoice 10,000. Let's go ahead and sync that with QuickBooks, and let's look at the final result. It will take a second, but nothing to be worried about. Yeah, so this is that error message, and it's just saying required parameter line dot amount is missing, and that's because we didn't have a subtotal when we went and synced it. So that's a little awkward. But if I go ahead and sync it now, then we can go and see that everything updates. We have a QuickBooks ID, sync token, tax, etc. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this, and we can see we have this invoice, which is due today. So with that, that's going to have to do it for our Salesforce to QuickBooks tutorial integration. See you in the next video.